afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for part 2 of the Leon and Josephine Winkelman Memorial Lecture, a person-centered approach to avoiding fraud and financial exploitation. Before we begin, I just want to go over a few housekeeping notes. If you wish to receive CEs for today's webinar, you will need to stay for the duration of the time and respond to all the poll questions you see pop up throughout the presentation. You will see the first one right now. So please go ahead and respond to that poll and feel free to elaborate your response in the chat. There will be time for Q&A at the end of the event, so please submit any questions you have in the Q&A box or the chat. We do encourage participation in the chat throughout today's event. We're going to take just another moment or two before we get started, so sit tight and remember to respond to the polls when you see them.
Hello, everyone. I'm Beth Angel. I'm the Dean of the School of Social Work, and I'm delighted to welcome you to part 2 of the 2023 Leon and Josephine Winkelman Memorial Lecture. Yesterday, Professor Christine Ajrouche discussed why the study of Arab Americans advances aging research and practice. Today, we're delighted to have Professor Peter Lichtenberg join us to discuss fraud and financial exploitation. Now, before we begin, just like yesterday, I want to share with you some of this lecture series history. Josephine Winkelman was a 1919 graduate of the University of Michigan's social work program. She worked at Hull House, a settlement house in Chicago. Her husband, Leon Winkelman, co-founded Winkelman Stores in Detroit with his brother Isidore in 1928. Their son, Stanley, was a leader in civic affairs in Detroit and deeply involved in social justice issues in the city. In 1978, the Leon and Josephine Memorial Lecture was created here at the school through an endowed gift from Stanley and his brothers as a tribute to their parents. The lecture provides a forum for presenting new and emerging knowledge from the social sciences and helping professions in the field of gerontology. The lecture also provides an opportunity to discuss the application of this knowledge to developing social policy, the organization and management of social welfare services in this area, and the delivery of social work services. We are very grateful to the Winkelman family for their support of this important annual event that informs our profession and provides an opportunity to honor our alumna, Josephine Winkelman, and her husband, Leon. I'd now like to introduce Professor Robert Joseph Taylor, who is serving as our moderator. Professor Taylor is the Harold R. Johnson Endowed Professor of Social Work and the Sheila Feld Collegiate Professor of Social Work. Robert is an esteemed and influential researcher who has published extensively on the informal social support networks, including family, friends, and church members of adult and elderly Black Americans. He has been a co-principal investigator on several National Institute of Mental Health grants on the correlation of mental health and mental illness among Black Americans. Robert's influence goes beyond his research. His leadership has directly impacted and encouraged a generation of social work scholars. He's the principal investigator of the Michigan Center for Urban African American Aging Research and the director of the Program of Research on Black Americans. Those two programs host a summer mentoring workshop, which Robert has directed since its inception in 1998. In 2021, Robert received the inaugural James Jackson Outstanding Mentorship Award from the Gerontological Society of America. So with that, I will turn things over to Robert, who will introduce our speaker for today. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you, Dean Angel. Good afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Peter Lichtenberg. Peter Lichtenberg is a professor of psychology at Wayne State. He is also the director of the Institute of Gerontology and the Merril Palmer Skillman Institute at Wayne State. The Institute of Gerontology sponsors lots of amazing programs for older adults in Southeast Michigan, including numerous health fairs, an Arts of Aging program, and lunch and learns. He is also the 2022 president of the Gerontological Society of America. He is a co-director of the National Institute on Aging funded Michigan Center for Urban African American Aging Research. He has authored 7 books and over 200 scientific journal articles. His area of research includes Alzheimer's disease, medical rehabilitation, and late life depression. He is particularly interested in the area of the intersection between financial capacity and financial exploitation, which is the topic of his presentation today. Please welcome Dr. Lichtenberg.
Thank you so much, Robert and Dean Angel, and thank you so much for having me to give this incredibly important lecture. I'm so honored. Let me share my screen, and while I do that, there we go. I just want to take you on a journey with me today in some of the ways that we've sort of evolved our research and translation of it into the community. We're going to examine the domains of financial capacity. And those domains, I'll give you the answer from the outset, include avoiding financial exploitation, making informed financial decisions, and managing personal finances. We're going to describe our research on person-centered tools and financial vulnerability tools. And I want to introduce our new wallet study. We're still recruiting for that study, so if I pique your interest, well, you can help me recruit a few more people. And our SAFE program and our website, Older Adult Nest Egg. So we have lots of things to discuss. And of course, none of this work is done without phenomenal colleagues and phenomenal support. I'm not going to give these names, but there's been a lot of people who have really guided us both across the country and here in Michigan. Now, those areas of financial capacity really get impacted by early memory loss. And so I've added that to this Venn diagram, that early memory loss coin, to show that this is where things start to get really complicated. And it doesn't have to be profound dementia before it starts impacting all 3 areas of capacity. Now let's take a look first at financial exploitation. We'll give it a simple definition: the misappropriation or misuse of funds of an older and or vulnerable adult. That includes fraud, includes family or friend exploitation, and includes exploitation by staff or professionals. And so right out of the bat, we want to find out a little bit more about the audience. And have you worked with an older adult who has experienced financial exploitation? We can see a fair amount of people have. 59 out of our 111 folks have worked with someone. So you can see this is really rampant in our society today, especially in the helping professions, the medical professions, medical social work, social services. Really, it becomes a social determinant of health. Ken Conrad and Mickey Iris developed what I think is a very useful conceptual model of financial exploitation. And the 6 domains here, all in kind of order of significance. The way I think about them is thefts or scams is how you lose the money. Someone either steals it or they deceive someone into giving them the money. But the next 3 are the mechanisms by which this kind of exploitation occurs: abuse of trust, so a trusted relationship, financial entitlement, which typically refers to adult children or other relatives, maybe grandchildren, nieces or nephews, who feel that as their relative is getting older and perhaps a little bit of dependency, start to think of particularly their parents' money or grandparents as their inheritance and feel entitled to use it. Of course, you and I know that as theft. Coercion or undue influence, much more pernicious. How do you use strategy and tactic to take somebody's free will away, substitute it with your own? And the last two elements are really risk factors for exploitation. But just a few examples of cases that I've been involved with to illustrate these elements. Abuse of trust. The older victim was an elderly lady who lived in an apartment building, which had a lot of close neighbors, young, some near her age, and she'd lived there for a long time, and there was a lot of social support. However, she started to fall and then started to become confused, and it really required her to move to assisted living. And at that point in time, her longtime financial planner, who rarely saw her when she lived in the apartment, all of a sudden became her trusted confidant. He kept other people away. He ended up not only becoming her executor, but also named as the sole inheritor of her will, and not her sister, who she talked to every week. Financial entitlement. The worst case of this that I've seen, an 85-year-old man who moved back to his home after a serious illness, very serious. They thought he might die, but he recovered. He recovered very well. He found out that his home was emptied out totally, and his car even was sold by his son, who had the power of attorney. This gentleman bounced back beautifully, and the car dealer was happy to bring him a new car. And coercion, a younger neighbor who'd been out of touch with an older man for over a decade because he had borrowed money from the older gentleman, never paid it back. And so the older gentleman didn't want to have anything to do with him. After the older man suffered a very severe traumatic brain injury with a brain bleed, a subdural hematoma, and resulted in dementia, the younger neighbor worked to make the older person paranoid of his son. And of course, it led to, over a short period of time, having his farm turned over to the younger neighbor and his assets. That was a clear case of undue influence. Financial exploitation really emerged back in the public eye with the MetLife study, which is a really interesting kind of historical footnote, because it was not a study of incidents of financial exploitation, but it was a study of how much coverage did the media give to different cases of exploitation. And the impact, they got an economist to sort of estimate all the losses. Shocked everybody because it was near $3 billion. And then when they did a follow-up, they saw there was a 10% increase between 2008 and 2010. And probably, like all the increases that we see in this field, it consists of both actual increase in exploitation and also increased sensitivity to the topic. And this is illustrated by the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau's 2019 report. And they get reports, these are required reports from financial institutions, two different types, deposit institutions, banks or credit unions, and money service businesses like MoneyGram or Western Union. And these suspicious activity reports quadrupled between 2013 and 2017, from 1,300 a month to 5,700. And the 2017 losses connected to the suspicious activity reports were near $2 billion. And note that 80% of these losses were to an older adult. The average was $34,000, but 7% lost over $100,000. And they had very different kinds of profiles. The money service businesses, as you can imagine, the Western Unions, the MoneyGrams, where you're wiring money, they were mostly stranger scams, relative in need scam, lottery scam, romance scams. Those are some of the most common forms, and that's indeed what they were seeing. Whereas in the deposit institution, the older person knew the suspected exploiter and brought them with them into the bank or the credit union to withdraw money. One of the awful footnotes of these data is when a fiduciary goes rogue, it really financially cripples an older person. The average loss was about $84,000. And of course, a fiduciary is someone who is legally obligated to act in the older person's best interest. What did we observe during COVID-19? We began to see the APS began seeing a skyrocketing number of romance scams. And I think romance scams are going to continue to increase, and they'll become, one of the top 2 or 3 scams that we see for older people. But interestingly, the patterns change too. Now banks and credit unions also seeing more romance scams. And older adults were reporting much higher rates of being contacted by would-be exploiters. Everybody knew where to find them. We all were kind of confined at home for a while. How much financial exploitation is there? We'll never know the exact number, but this survey by Ron Asiarno, the National Prevalence Survey, really has held up over time. About 5% report being victimized of exploitation each year, which was second only to emotional abuse. Financial exploitation is way more common than physical or sexual abuse. And in meta-analysis of about 90,000 adult protective service cases, what they found is that 80% of those cases of financial exploitation that were investigated were pure financial exploitation. They didn't include other forms of exploitation. Scott Beach found that older adult victims since age 60, so a much broader time span, but 10%. And David Burns did a meta-analysis on just fraud and found about 5%. These predictors that I have down here were fairly modest, whether it's financial strain or physical vulnerability or psychological factors such as depression. They were significant, but they were modest. But when we had the chance, using the health and retirement sub-study, the Leave Behind questionnaire, to take a look at national data on fraud and predictors thereof, what we found was if psychological vulnerability was examined a little more sophisticated fashion, where it was an interaction of both high depression and low social needs fulfillment, that older adults who had those characteristics were reporting fraud at 3 times the rate of the rest of the sample, which always underscores that all of us can be victims of fraud. The scammers are quite sophisticated, but some people are at more risk. And when we took the 2012 data and we followed people for 4 years, only the people who had not in 2012 reported any fraud. So nobody had reported fraud at all for this longitudinal study. By 2016, when they did the Leave Behind questionnaire and look back at fraud, the social need, our psychological vulnerability measure was 2.5 times more predictive, more prevalent of exploitation. And so we see that it made a deep impression on me that the social factors can be a huge aspect of this. Up to this point in time, I think everybody was so focused on just the cognitive factors. Now, in elder justice, when Adult Protective Services or any law enforcement goes out to look at financial exploitation, they really need to keep in mind that we need to balance protecting autonomy and helping provide protection. And it's a tough call to make, but has significant impact. Underprotection can be lead to gross financial exploitation, but overprotection can be equally costly because older adults, just like younger adults, have a strong need to have a control of their life and their decisions. And it doesn't just impact quality of life. Some studies have found that it actually shortened longevity when they lost control too early. So we go to our second poll question. Have you conducted a financial capacity assessment with an older adult? Well, wait, so we'll recap. Over half of the audience had worked with an older adult who had been financially exploited or knew one. And now we'll see how many have actually conducted a financial capacity assessment. And only a few people have. And so let me introduce you to what the traditional approaches have been in terms of assessing the financial capacity part, not the neurocognitive part, but just the financial capacity part. And this comes from Dan Marson's review in 2001. One way was observation. You either just ask the person about their finances or you ask a collateral family member. Another way was through instruments that were specific to kind of financial management and financial knowledge, such as Dan's financial capacity instrument. Or you could just interview people on each of the 8 domains that he created for financial capacity. Or finally, you could just give them a neuropsychological battery or even a test and say, well, if you didn't pass, then you don't have financial capacity. Well, there's a lot that leaves to be desired with those approaches because they really aren't specific to the capacity in question. As we say, with a lot of cases of financial exploitation that adult protective service workers are called to investigate, the older person may say to them, well, that's what I want to do. How do they then assess if that's an informed decision? And that's sort of left out of the other models. And so we went about trying to create a person-centered approach to financial capacity that you'll see as we go on really intersects with exploitation. And we use Ben Mass' whole person dementia assessment approach, which integrates person-centered ideas with a standardized assessment. And kind of the 3 things that I always think about with this approach is that context matters. In other words, knowing the person and their life really matters. What is their experience with money and financial decisions, for example? The voice of the older person is critical. So many times, if there's a person that has any kind of cognitive impairment, they never get to tell their story. Their collateral is always asked about it. And real life decisions versus vignettes. And this comes out of research in the medical field that showed that even with people who have cognitive impairment, they know their own medical conditions oftentimes, but not if they have to learn a whole new set, like in a vignette. And we wanted to combine what we were going to do with the person-centered approach with the Applebaum and Grisso 4 aspects of informed financial decision-making. This really came about during mental health reform decades ago when nationwide guardianship laws changed. Now they're all each done by the state, but they almost all changed. As a matter of fact, I think they all did. It used to be that if my dad had a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, I'd go to the court, petition for guardianship, and give him the doctor's note that he had this diagnosis, and that would be it. but the law has changed to say, hey, diagnosis is not enough to take away your autonomy. It has to be a functional test. And what is that functional test? Why, it's informed decision-making, choice, understanding, appreciation, and reasoning. And we can see this in our Michigan laws. So I've kind of highlighted for you two of the different legal standards for capacities that we often deal with. One is to enter into a contract. And you have to have the mind to understand what you're doing and also understand the nature and effect of the act or the appreciation. So do you understand what the contract is all about, how it will impact you? And do you appreciate the potential risks and benefits of it? Can you reason around the contract, and can you make a choice to sign it? Even testamentary capacity, making a will, which is the lowest standard because it just has been seen as an inalienable right for humans since centuries ago in English law, has the same language. Does the person have the ability to understand the general nature and effect of signing a will? So we wanted to take our contextual ideas along with the Applebaum and Grisso ideas and combine them. And we used the same method that Ken Conrad and Mickey Irish did. As a matter of fact, we hired them to lead it, concept mapping. And what you do is you get a couple groups of experts. One group we had was national, the other group was local. And with all the work that we do back and forth, I think we had a total of 6 meetings, 3 for each. We create a new conceptual model for financial decision-making and a final list of items. And here's our model. So you can see those contextual factors: financial awareness, psychological vulnerability, and susceptibility. And they impact those intellectual factors, which really has so much to do with the integrity of a financial decision. How well informed is it? And it's important to think about values. I often don't know how to integrate this in and assess it, but it is very important through history maybe to think about what is the value that the person holds. Well, I gave you a preview that our financial decision-making scales related to financial exploitation. And this is our first study on that, in which we looked at a risk score because we chose a multiple choice test in our financial decision-making questionnaire so we could derive risk scores. And we looked at those who had financial exploitation, or what we called in this paper suspected, because we weren't able to verify it for sure, versus those who did not. And we found that our scale significantly differentiated those. Those higher scores are risk scores. And so higher risk scores in those with financial exploitation, meaning risk of not making informed decision, concerns about decisional abilities. And if you look separately then at cognitive status, those with some PCD, possible cognitive decline, they had declines or lower scores on 4 out of the 10 tests. They weren't in the range of mild cognitive impairment or dementia, but just that possible cognitive decline doubled the rate of having financial exploitation. Now, out of our 55, which became a 34 item scale, key to it are the 10 items for our screening scale, because we created for mental health professionals our rating scale, but we really wanted anybody to be able to screen for informed financial decision making. And so I want to share with you some of the work that we've done on that. First of all, it's 10 items. You got to see just the sheet. I know you couldn't read that. Don't worry, I'll show you the items and the answers. And it's in an interview format. It's multiple choice, so it makes it easy for the older person to answer. And it focuses on those informed decision-making factors, those intellectual factors. Also, a couple questions that pull for autonomy, so that we can see a potential for any undue influence. But the professional has to actually rate each item, and what they're rating is how accurately how accurate was the older person's answer. And that in part helps us derive a risk score. So here are the questions. You can see the choice question. What's the financial decision you're making? And one of the autonomy questions, whose idea is this? Then what's the purpose? What's your rationale for doing this? Then we get into some understanding and appreciation questions. What's the primary financial goal? How will this decision impact you financially now and over time? See those understanding questions. And how much risk is involved to your financial well-being, and how may someone else be negatively affected? Another powerful understanding question, who benefits most from this financial decision? So we understand that people can have multiple goals and multiple people can benefit, but we want to see if in an informed decision, whether people know who benefits most and what the primary goals are. So we started out by working with attorneys, financial planners, and adult protective service workers, and got the reliability and validity of our scale. We trained them on how to administer it. They made their own ratings. We didn't have a scoring system at that time. We were taking a look to see then how our scoring system matched up. And then we cross-validated the findings with a total adult protective service sample. And we even looked at item response theory to see if each individual item was necessary. Well, here's the easy part of it, that there's the multiple choice options. So you can see that it's easy to respond to these. Who's it benefiting? Is the primary purpose to benefit you, benefit somebody else, please somebody? What's your primary financial goal? Are you trying to earn money? Are you trying to meet a lifestyle need? You're trying to give a gift? How will this decision impact you financially now and over time? Improve your position, no impact, or a negative impact? And similarly about risk. And who benefits most? You do, family member, somebody else does, charity or organization. And finally, at the end, we have another autonomy question. To what extent did you talk with anyone regarding this decision? Well, let me give you a case example that actually came out of a social work practice that was using our scale. This was a grandmother who, in the course of social work intervention with her and treatment, relayed that she was going to buy her grandson a new home. And this alerted the social worker. She was a little nervous about this, and so she administered our scale. She was nervous because she knew that the grandmother had relatively few resources, and that using those resources to buy her grandson a home would cause some financial hardship. And also worried about future financial responsibilities if the grandson doesn't pay for the mortgage. And guess what? The grandson was in no position to be owning a home. He was never gainfully employed. He was marginally employed at the time. He had no resources. And so there's a huge risk. So the social worker used the scale and the items to really have a conversation, and the grandmother decided not to purchase the home. So after working with adult protective services and validating our scale and cross-validating it, we embarked with them on an implementation science project. And we wanted to see, could we integrate our 10-item scale particularly with regular practice? And the question I have, the third poll question is, have you or your organization integrated a new evidence-based assessment tool or intervention in your work? And about 1/3 have. So great, we have some experience with this in the audience, and the other 2/3, well, hopefully we'll tell you something new. You know, implementation science really examines the translation of evidence-based practice into widespread usage. And to do so, it uses conceptual models and methods that are not typically governed by rationality. Because if adoption of evidence-based practices were straightforward and rational, we'd just publish good papers and they'd be disseminated and everybody, or a lot of people, would use them. The model we chose was the Paris model, promoting action in research, implementation, the health sciences, and has 3 basic elements: evidence, context, and facilitation. And the evidence, I've already kind of alluded to all the background work we did to show that this was an evidence-based tool. I'm going to explore with you the context and the facilitation and how it worked out. And our website, olderadultnestegg.com, was key to the whole effort. So our goal was to use our online training and scoring system to have all Michigan APS workers trained and certified in using the scale. So we did a lot of different kind of webinars, and we created a narrated self-paced training and certification on our website. We also improved the system so I could review people's scales and send them questions and feedback. But why? Why would Michigan APS, Adult Protective Service, be interested in doing this? And that was the context. It so happened that when I came to ask them about this, it came about 6 to 12 months after APS had been audited. And in contrast to Child Protective Services, the auditors noted that APS had a lack of risk scoring tool to use in cases, and especially financial exploitation. So that was a huge context. Of course, having the website for training and certification and calculating risk scores and receiving recommendations also enabled statewide implementation. And structurally, we were assigned an APS liaison who had access to the most senior leaders and also all the supervisors. And finally, just the structural way that APS is divided in Michigan is divided not by every county, but in 5 geographic sectors. So we didn't have to deal with however many counties there are in Michigan. I lost count. What about the facilitation factors? Well, I tried to show that I was very committed to this, so I went out and did trainings live or webinar. All the trainings were completed before the pandemic. I was also able to review cases, as I said, but we really had a very strong commitment of the sector supervisors. They also believed that risk scoring tools were really important for the practice and for using the findings to help them advance the older person's well-being. And the electronic record had specific results for financial exploitation cases. And we shared some case studies. One of the things that really helped was we had a credible focus group that helped us then develop further tools. We had a decision tree that we developed and a user's guide. I was very curious as to what kind of decisions are people actually making out there that when a financial exploitation case comes up. And we could see it was pretty well variable. About 25% were giving a gift, a little bit over that. Many fewer were making a major purchase or just allowing someone else access to their money. The most common thing was allowing someone else to take over their finances. And also the third most common was participating in a scam. So we could see it's a wide variety and important ones. And except for participating in a scam, there's no obvious reason why somebody should have impaired decision making. The APS workers rated about 40% of the cases they came to had some impaired decision making. And we were pleased to see that over 90% of the time they agreed with the risk score that they got from our older adult nest egg.com system. These were the questions that stood out. All of them actually were significant. All the questions that we actually score. There's 7 items that are scored in our algorithm, but these 3 had a pretty good moderate effect sizes, some even bordering on strong. How will this decision impact you now and over time? How much risk is there to your financial well-being, and who benefits most from this decision? So that grandmother I was telling you about, when she was asked that question, said, well, I do. Makes me feel really good to give my grandson a house. Well, of course it does, but actually the grandson would benefit the most. And so when she started to put her head into this and realize kind of the risks and what she was doing, she was able to change it. Now, we also created an informant scale. So we have the rating scale, the screening scale, and the informant scale, which is a family member or friend or professional's view on the older adult's decision-making and vulnerability factors. So one APS worker was incredibly skilled, and he used both the informant scale, the family and friends interview, and the 10-item screening scale in a very complicated case, because this was an older gentleman who befriended a woman 40, 50 years younger than himself and her girlfriend, who both moved into the home. And we often see then at this point, the older person just saying, well, this is what I want, it's my choice, get out of my life, APS worker. The family, of course, was concerned about exploitation. And what he did was he engaged the younger woman. He said, I really need to know about the abilities of this older person. Could you fill out this scale for me? It would really be helpful. And she did. So she went off to another room. And at the same time, he took the older gentleman through the 10-item scale. He also had gotten the informant scale from the 2 children. And lo and behold, of course, the only person that said this guy didn't have any issues was the woman that was trying to exploit him. And she eventually was convicted. I do want to mention, I won't go into great detail, but we have the Successful Aging Through Financial Empowerment program. And what do? We actually, I say we, but social worker Latoya Hall, who's pictured there, because she has a background in financial coaching and economic advocacy. She'll take scam and identity theft victims, older people, or caregivers if they have questions, and she will work with them one-on-one to repair their credit, make the proper reports to the proper authorities and agencies. She'll contact creditors. It's really quite an amazing program, and anybody can refer. And because of the pandemic, we found that, boy, virtual services, everybody's happy. It's easy to schedule. We can do it on the phone, also use computers. And so please contact Latoya if you're concerned about anybody. Well, we asked the conceptual question about context. How much does context matter? Forget the intellectual factors of decision making. We see the overlap between decision making and exploitation. How much does context matter in the exploitation experience? So we examined 34 items from our scale, and we found that 17 of them fell out beautifully. They were internally consistent, so they were measuring one thing, vulnerability. And the area under the curve, 0.80, said, hey, this could be a clinical tool. And so here we go. We got our fourth tool, the Financial Exploitation Vulnerability Survey, which on our website, everything gets renamed on our website because the web people don't like the names that I give them. And it's the Financial Vulnerability Survey. Well, in comparing a financial exploitation group to no financial exploitation, I think it's important to understand that people who are financially exploited are often vulnerable on multiple domains. So here, this table, the last three boxes really show the significantly lower cognitive scores that people who were exploited had compared to the community sample. And they were matched on age and gender. And our cut score of 7, we then were able to cross-validate this. I'm still arguing with my doctoral student about when she's going to publish this paper, but we'll see. So we said, we got to put this on our website, and we got to create an older adult landing page. We have all these things for professionals. We actually were creating all these things for caregivers in another manner, financial things. Let's create this older adult landing page and let's put our survey out there. Well, AARP found out about us and said, you know, you want to find out how vulnerable you are, take a good survey. And there it is. Those are the 17 items. Let's take a look, though. It really kind of falls into 3 categories. One is kind of financial factors, whether it's financial self-efficacy, financial strain or satisfaction, or even financial behaviors. Those are the questions. You can see it's very easy to answer. People can go on our site. They don't have to create an account to fill out the scale, and they'll get results. How often do you worry about financial decisions you've recently made? If you're a practicing clinician, this is a great question to put in your toolbox. We were shocked at, we were using it for our rating scale, and we found out so many times it just opened up the gates to finding out about some exploitation that was going on. How often do your monthly expenses exceed your regular monthly income? Then we get into the psychological vulnerability questions, and we adapted some, but this one, how often do you wish you had someone to talk to about financial decisions, transactions, or plans? No matter what sample we've used, we come in with right about 50% of people say, at least sometimes, I wish I had someone to talk to. And unfortunately, scammers know that. They really know that people are feeling somewhat isolated about money. It's somewhat of a taboo topic, and there's not many people to talk to about it. Well, how about psychological factors? Do you feel anxious about your finances? Do you have a confidant? Do you feel downhearted and blue? Or are your memory or thinking skills worse? And then the last gets into kind of relationship issues around money. And about a quarter of our samples have said yes to this question. Does a relationship with a family member or friend become strained due to finances as you've gotten older? Did anyone ever tell you that someone else wants to take your money? And how likely is it that someone would take your money without your permission? Well, we put this on our website. We had a great response. And I'll tell you, now that it's been up just over 2 years, we have over 2,000 responses. But we, after just a few months, decided to look at the first 240. And we ask a couple of introductory questions. Is your memory less reliable than it used to be? And do you live alone? As well as demographic factors. And here's what we found. Those who live alone had higher risk scores. And those with memory complaints had higher risk scores. You can see that those with memory complaints had very high risk scores at the rate of about 4 times, I guess 3.5 times those without memory complaints. And for living alone, it's about 2.5 times. But 46% of those with memory complaints are scoring in the risk range. Now you combine the two and look at the interaction of living alone with memory complaints, and you see really roughly about 2/3 of everybody who lives alone with memory complaints having very high financial vulnerability. And we created a user's guide for professionals who are administering this. We now have what we call the FVS Pro, where a professional can assign this to somebody simply by creating an email link. And it encourages people to have follow-up discussions and some probing questions to use. But our work really is fueled by our website. And I want to let you know that all of our trainings, getting an account, using our tools, all that can be done at no charge to anybody, and everybody is welcome to do that. The landing page for professionals, you can see the landing page for older adults. They can even request some services of the SAFE program and a caregiver landing page. So that's olderadultnestegg.com, and there is no cost to you. We've been very fortunate in the grant support that we've had. Well, you can see we've had a lot of people trained over 4 years, almost 5,000. We've had a lot of scales administered. And what's just amazing to me, and I think it goes along with that question of how often do you wish you had someone to talk to about financial decisions, is that almost 2,000 people now have gone on the site in the last 2 years to find out what their own financial vulnerability is. Now, the last thing I want to introduce you to is our wallet study. And we're examining early memory loss and its impact on personal finance. And Matthew Rowling, the MBA of our group, is an expert on personal finance. So he sort of helped me learn, how do you examine 12 months worth of somebody's checking account? And the first study we published was a feasibility study. I should tell you that we're over 120 of our 150 target. So if you wonder if anybody would do this, the answer is yes. And people do it for a variety of reasons. A lot of times, again, they want to have someone to talk to about their finances and make sure they're doing things properly. In this study, we do offer Latoya's services for anybody who even needs just budgeting assistance. Well, here's what we learned. We came up with a reliable method of not only going through the account, but then also interviewing the older person. And we make sure that they are the primary on the checking account. We determine their regular income, their inflows and outflows. We inspect for late fees, for late payments, penalties for bounce checks, and we also look at withdrawals. Although I'll tell you, all the things that we thought about the way older people use money, it's changing dramatically. Very few people withdraw much money anymore. Most people either get it at the drugstore or they don't use cash at all. We ascertain unusual expenditures, and then we stress test categories of expenses. And this beautiful chart that Robert, my colleague Wasim, put together is really a correlation table. And we can see that financial decision-making and financial vulnerability, which is not shown here, both related to financial exploitation and to wealth loss. And in this model, once we account for financial behaviors for wealth loss, the decision-making scale is sort of redundant. But with regard to financial exploitation cases, it's not. And so let me summarize our journey together today, which has been my great pleasure to present. We created this new conceptual model and evidence-based scale to assess informed decision-making for a specific decision. It led us to create 3 other scales and to really get deep into financial exploitation investigation. We had some really interesting experience with implementation science. And I really like the Paris model. It's not the most sophisticated one, but that suits me because it's pretty straightforward and it's very interesting context and facilitation factors. Financial vulnerability and our 17-item self-report measure, really making it accessible to people, how vulnerable they are. We're actually now starting a new project where we're going to, with several partners, including a credit union and a medical clinic, people with risk scores that are above the cutoff, we're going to offer them a financial exploitation prevention program, a 2 to 3 session program that explores financial vulnerability, financial literacy, and some financial planning. Not investing, but planning, organizing, choosing trusted advocates, and so forth. I told you just a little bit about the SAFE program and invite you to seek our resources for that. And LaToya does do a lot of community education as well. So if you have a community group or professional group that you would like her to speak at, she does a ton. And I introduced you to our website. There's a lot of good stuff there. The thing I didn't mention is we have a lot of websites and other resources on our site. So there's a lot of resources that you can learn about. And that's the end of our journey. And I'm really eager to take any questions or expand on anything. I'll stop the screen share.
Thank you, Peter. This was absolutely great. I have several questions. So what I'm going to ask is if you can just give some brief responses, okay?
Yes.
We have five, 6 questions, and I'm sure a few more will come. So the first 2 are just related, especially related to the talk. So what's the definition of social needs fulfillment?
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I should have defined that. There's 3 aspects to it. The need for affection, the need for behavioral confirmation. In other words, somebody else telling you that what you do is important, and the need for status, some recognition. And what we found that behavioral confirmation and status were the 2 social needs that really interacted with high rates of depression to predict fraud, such that basically we're looking at people who feel invisible and are also very downhearted and blue.
Thank you, Peter. And related, what does, when you use the term vignette, could you just explain the context, real life versus vignettes?
Yeah. So a vignette is, let's say there's a paragraph and I tell you this guy has a heart condition and there's a surgery that he might take, and here's the risks and benefits and so forth. But you as a person may not have a heart condition, you know nothing about it. And that's a kind of an objective vignette.
Thank you, Peter. Another thing is, and you sort of mentioned this, but when I watch various documentaries about really mostly about romance scams, but about various scamming, what comes out a lot is loneliness and social isolation, which is much more with older adults as being the victims. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Is that in your studies, or I guess the research in general?
Absolutely, I can tell you a little bit that we aren't specifically researching romance scams, but I do know a lot about them. I've been involved in a number of cases with them, and also follow the research. And you're absolutely right, Robert. Loneliness really comes out. What people who are romance scammers are doing is they're really looking at social media to see who's looking for a partner. They're also looking to see who's recently been widowed. They're very sophisticated in how they scope out targets.
I just want to mention something that's really not a question, but there's a television show on National Geographic called To Catch a Smuggler. And what I have seen just through watching the show is that a lot of older adults have been caught trafficking drugs as part of a romance scam. So even though we talk about financial, which obviously is obviously bad, drug trafficking lands you in prison.
Yep. Thank you, Robert, because one of the things that authorities really struggle with, and not just drugs, but other kinds of mules, people who are channeling money, and so that the scammers end up getting that, but the older person gets some too, and they're scamming the system that way. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So here's another question. So what can we do about professional court-appointed guardianship companies who are not held accountable by the courts?
Right. So I'm proud to be a member of the Attorney General's Elder Abuse Task Force, and they actually have some legislation that they really think has a good chance of passing that will do some guardianship reforms. As you may know, and if you go on the Attorney General's website, you'll see a number of headlines over the last 2 years. They've really started to go after all kinds of guardians who have been, and other fiduciaries who have been stealing money from older people.
Thanks, Peter. So another question. It seems that there's a generalized lack of financial literacy within a large part of our population of all age groups. This lack of understanding combined with misconceptions about finance, law, and one's own capacity to evaluate financial issues seems to be leading to a perfect storm as seniors' cognitive abilities decline. Is there any public policy addressing these issues?
Thank you so much for that question. And one of our studies on financial resources and stressors related to exploitation found that financial vulnerability and financial literacy were both significant predictors of who was exploited, but they were not related to one another. So you're absolutely right. There is a relatively low level, and the Health and Retirement Survey has documented this with the 3-item Lusardi and Mitchell scale that they use for financial literacy. Unfortunately, there is no public policy, although what Dr. Mitchell tells me is that more high school kids are receiving some financial literacy coursework than they saw in the previous generation. So there is hope, but it is part of our prevention project is to help people identify which areas of financial literacy are pertinent to their life so that we can assist them with gaining a little bit more.
And this is sort of related to the previous question about social isolation. So have you researched the role of older persons' involvement in social support groups, both family and non-family, in relationship to exploitation?
We have not.
Mm-hmm.
We have not.
Mm-hmm.
And I would hope that it would reduce it. The one proviso is, though, that even if you're in a support group for other things, finance is still a pretty taboo topic and doesn't come up in many support groups. And in our caregiver work, for example, when we did our focus groups, we found that caregivers were starved to talk about this. There really were nobody talking to them about the financial aspects.
Yeah. Now, and let me just mention, Peter, I think this question is less about support groups per se, but more about social support networks like family and friends.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I misunderstood the question, and it is a great question. And I believe that the stronger social supports, and we've seen it in our own studies, so stronger social supports are related to less financial exploitation.
Generally speaking, what are the demographic characteristics of the individual in your studies?
So we have a variety of different studies. We've had some national studies through the Health and Retirement Survey, not just the fraud studies, but we also had a perceived financial vulnerability module that went in there. So we're happy to be able to compare our other demographics. Our wallet study really mimics the US population. Same financial literacy score as Mitchell and Lusardi, and right about the same median income. A quarter of our group in the wild study earn over $70,000 a year. Quarter earn less than $25,000.
Thank you, Peter.
Our SAFE program, though, is working with, and of course we do study a very marginalized community. Here, 2/3 of Black adults who earn $20,000 or less per year.
Okay. Peter, what's interesting, going back to social support, is it's a fascinating dynamic, like all family relationships, that in some cases you have support networks that are protective. And then in other cases, like the one you mentioned with the grandmother and the grandson, where it's the exact opposite, is financial exploitation.
Yes. Yes, and Robert, thank you, because we just sent in a revision on paper. We're looking at people who are exploited by someone they trusted versus someone that was a total stranger. And boy, the impacts, including loss of more money, and boy, the psychological impacts of having that. And we used Jennifer Gomez's betrayal trauma theory approach, and it was right on. You know, the loss of abusing trust really impacts people in profound ways.
Yeah. So this is a clarification question. Did you state that financial exploitation is second only to emotional abuse as coding for APS referral?
For not APS referral, not coding for that, but for Ron Asiarno's questionnaire. And I don't think he actually measured self-neglect or anything like that.
Okay. And here's a question. Then the individual states that I appreciate the work that has been done to spread these tools across Michigan through the use by APS. I'm curious whether this is being used nationally and whether the services/website are appropriate for older adults in states outside of Michigan.
With that, excuse me, without a doubt, they're appropriate. It's being used now in Riverside County, California. We've seen a lot of counties in Minnesota using it. It's being used in Merril and different parts of San Francisco and Oakland. But it has, hasn't been adopted by everybody, at least not yet.
Thanks, Peter. I just, and again, we've gone through just about all the questions. If you have any other questions, feel free. We have about 4 or 5 more minutes. But I just saw a documentary that I wanted to mention. It was on the Hulu network, but I can't remember the name of the television show. But it was about scamming, and mostly older people, almost exclusively. And they mentioned 2 locations, and what I didn't understand is how big of a business this was. So this was out of Jamaica, over 300 million a year, and out of Israel, over $1 billion a year.
Wow.
2 locations.
And I know in Jamaica, the U.S. Postal Service is down there all the time. They have an investigative arm, and it really has driven out the drug trade. People are really into the scamming, and it is huge business. Yep. And selling these lists is huge business.
Yeah. So again, they mentioned what was good about this is they mentioned both Jamaica and Israel. And Israel, it was more in terms of stocks and bonds, but it's still preying upon the same population.
Yeah.
So we have 2 more quick questions. What's being done to prosecute individuals who commit these crimes against older adults?
So in Michigan, of course, there's an unjust enrichment statute, which means if you know or had reason to know that this was a vulnerable person, an older person, and you used and took their money, you could be charged. And some prosecutors do charge that, and I do some pro bono work around the state for those cases, but they're fewer and farther between than we would hope.
Yeah. That's always a problem with things like this, is that it's just seemed almost like a victimless crime, even though we know it's clearly not. And the one thing a person in the chat mentions that the people I'm aware of served no time because they had better lawyers. So last question, are there any measures that an older adult can take to protect themselves from financial exploitation?
Well, they can go on our website, they can take the financial vulnerability survey, and it does come with a series of recommendations and other resources. I think being educated about it helps. Also, making a plan for who their trusted advocate is, and organizing their financial information, those kinds of things, improving their literacy and having someone to turn to also helps.
Yeah. And Peter, just want to mention your website is linked to the Institute of Gerontology at Wayne State.
Yes, it's a separate website, but we have a link on on the IOG website, and so olderadultnestegg.com.
Okay. And what we'll do is Peter will give this information to Emma, and our CE office will send that out. So again, just for the audience, I did put a link in that I could access pretty easily, but it turns out several people couldn't access it. So hopefully we will get that to everybody. Peter, Dr. Lichtenberg, thank you very much for a great presentation. We have been working together for over 20 years, and I thoroughly learned a lot and thoroughly enjoyed this. So thank you very much. And I could tell from the audience replies, you see the hand clapping, that they have enjoyed it also. Dean?
Thank you so much, Robert.
Dean Angel, would you like to say anything?
I'm just saying thank you as well. This was incredibly informative, and I know we all are leaving with much more knowledge of this really important issue than before. Thank you so much, Peter.
Thank you, Dean Angel.
And again, thank you everybody in the audience today. We tend to have the Winkelman lecture right around this time every year, and we look forward to seeing you again next year. Again, thank you everybody, and have a good rest of the day, and hopefully this winter storm doesn't hit us too bad.